U.S. President Donald Trump has imposed a 21% tariff on imports from Namibia as part of a broader initiative to address what he calls trade imbalances towards the U.S. Now, the action is expected to significantly impact Namibia's key exports, that is to the United States, affecting Namibia's various key export products. Now, to discuss the effects of this on Namibia, I am joined in studio by Roberth Disho Kaveto, a senior policy analyst at the Namibia Trade Forum. Robert, good evening and a warm welcome to Business Today. Thank you so much for making time for us this evening.
Good evening and nice to be here.
All right. Now, to just establish this interview, Robert, perhaps for somebody that is watching and does not understand what tariffs mean and the importance or the reasons why we are having this discussion going on in and around the entire nation, in the nation as well as globally, perhaps just give us an explanation, a brief explanation of what tariffs are and, of course, how they are applied, that is, in international trade.
Good. Thank you very much for the question. The first thing that I'll do is I would like also to explain the term AGOA, because it has been used quite sometimes in terms of the way it's now is not also defined properly. So the AGOA, we are looking at nothing else but the African Growth Opportunity Act. Now, when you look at the explanation itself or the definition thereof, it says growth and opportunity. Now, you should also remember that when we are looking at the AGOA, we are looking at a preferential trade agreement, which means we never negotiated on this one. But then there was a preferential that the USA market have realized, so look, they want now in terms of opening their markets for the Namibian product so that we can also start exporting. And in terms of growth, and then the opportunity they're talking about the market opportunity in the US market. Now, in terms of now the application thereof, how is that applied? Let's say in terms of tariff, we are looking at the 21% that was imposed also of recent. Now, we are looking at, look, in terms of the product that is imported maybe from Namibia to the USA, then in the local market, which is Namibia, it's costing $10, for example. And then you are exporting it to the US market. Then once they apply that 21% on that product, which means it will now go up with $2.10. And then it will cost now $12.10 in the local market. The local market, I'm referring now to the US market. So now what does that do now in terms of now the product of the Namibian product? It becomes uncompetitive on the local market, which is in the US market now, because it's now in terms of the price is higher. Now, in terms of now looking at the price, it's a comparative issue. You have to look at what is produced locally, which is in the US market, comparing to the import. Once you impose the 21% tariff, which means now you are also increasing the price of that product, and it becomes uncompetitive. Because you are looking at the issue of demand and supply now, whereby now the consumer will look at the price of the local product comparing to the import. And the question is, do I really need to consume the imported product, or should I now consume the local one, which is cheaper? So that is the dynamic in terms of now how is the tariff applied. Because the other thing that you should also link to is that tariff is nothing else but tax that is imposed on a product. So that is how we should look at it in a layman's language.
All right. Now, Robert, talk to us about your reaction. When you heard about this 21% tariff on Namibian goods, what was your immediate reaction?
Yeah, my immediate reaction is in terms of, like I indicated earlier on, that this was a preferential trade agreement. And now looking at the regime, the biggest regime in the USA market, in the US economy, which said they have to give preferential to the less developed and the developing country. Now, after putting these measures in place in order now to develop those other markets or the other countries who are less developed, now you come back again to impose tariffs on those products. Now, the reaction was a little bit, it also took me back to say, look, what was the reason in terms of now bringing this preferential treatment in place if they could not honor it? So, and also we looked at now also the products, the exportation of product from Namibia to the US. Now, more specifically, I looked at the fish in terms of now the trade figures for last year. You're looking at 8.5 million that was exported to the US market. Now you look at that figure and then you link it now in terms of the supply chain thereof. To say if that figure drops, then what happens now to the supply chain? Now the supply chain, you are looking at the person who's producing the tins, because if you're looking at the canned, for example, but for this time we are talking about the frozen hake that is exported. Now those ones were in the production of the packaging material. How are they affected? So all those are now the rippling effect that we have to look at and see how do you go about it. So now then you are now also set back to look, maybe in terms of the intervention from the government side, you have now to put in incentives to incentivize so these producers so that they can be competitive in the international market.
All right.
Yes.
Now, Robert, how were the trading arrangements between the U.S. and Namibia in terms, that is, of these tariffs before they were actually announced or rather imposed on the 21% that was imposed? How were they before?
Yeah, previously, in terms of the preferential trade agreement, there was zero import tariff that was applied on the Namibian product. When you are exporting Namibian product from Namibia to the USA, there was zero import in terms of tariff. And then in terms of now the import, if you are importing goods from the USA, there was already, they also agreed to say, look, you can apply the 40% on this product, because there was a preferential treatment to say, look, even though we are opening up the market for the Namibian product to come on our shelf, but then we are not imposing any tariff. But you, as a developing country, you can also import tariffs. That is also the reason, if you look at now in terms of infant industry protection, for example, if I can give you an example of such, to say, no, you can also protect your industry here because of the influx of imports. The moment you zero rate everything, then there will be influx of imports, and then your local producer, they might be pushed out of the business. So, but then the US, look, we are not imposing any, but you can bring your product without any imposition of tariffs. But then the Namibian economy, as a less developed country, or the developing country, you can also now impose some of this tariff. Because, like I indicated in the definition of AGOA, to say it's for growth and then opportunity. Now, in the growth space, you're looking at, look, you impose to protect the local producer as well, so that you can be competitive as well.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's touch on the local, let's delve actually deeper on the local producer and the consumers. How will they suffer when these tariffs are actually high? Perhaps just give typical examples that is in this regard, and in the same breath, just talk to us, in what form do these new tariffs affect Namibia's economy broader? Just give us a broader definition and examples.
Okay. In terms of now the exporter, for example, how will it affect them? Is in the issue of saying, are they really competitive in the foreign market comparing to the local market? Now, in competitive, what do I mean by that is that, are they also still going to sell on the same volume that has been, or they are exporting on the same volume that has been exporting previously before the imposition of this tariff? So, which means obviously the export will drop. Now, what does it tell you? It tells you also in the sense that, look, in terms of even employment creation, there's also a question mark already on it, simply because, are you going to retain the previous the status in terms of the employment number of people that you have employed already in your company? Are you going to retain them, or are you going to reduce, scale down? So it's also in terms of now the revenue collection, the government side, or either in terms of now our association to the SACCO. So all those issues will be affected. And now coming back to the issue of now of the consumer, for example. Now, you have two consumers in this regard. You have one which is seated in the US in terms of our import of hake. Then the question is, how is that affected? The prices of those goods will go up. Because remember that in terms of the demand and supply, it's not immediate in terms of now when the supply drops, then the price goes up. Then what happens now to the consumer? They have also to rethink immediately to say whether should I still continue purchasing or either consuming this good, or should I go now to the substitute? So which means now the consumer in the US market will be affected in terms of the price, even though they will adjust, but it might take in the long run. It might take too long. But then the local consumer now in the Namibian economy, it will be also be a little bit at ease, but then looking at the demand, how much is supplied locally? Because some of these products that we are exporting, how much is supplied locally, and in terms of the price of those products. Because remember, like I indicated earlier on in terms of tariff, this is taxes that you are imposing on the product, but then the end consumer, they are the ones who suffer the most, because the producer will transfer now that cost to the consumer in that regard. So in this regard, is now the consumer who either suffer.
All right. Let's go back to AGOA. As mentioned earlier, you gave quite a brief description right there. Talk to us about how it has affected AGOA. I mean, how these new tariffs have affected AGOA, and seeing that it's coming to an end in September. Is there perhaps, are we looking at a renewal contract, or talk to us about it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thought, like I've indicated also, is to say, look, in terms of either we are going to renew this preferential trade agreement because it will be ending in September. So it also now put us on a position to say, look, we as Namibians, we have to rethink in terms of either to retaliate the imposition of tariff. Then you are going into the space of what we call trade war. We don't want to venture into the space for now. The best way is to look, we sit back, we wait for September, for example, and also looking at the trade that has taken place already, that I have already indicated. So now looking at the trade figures for last year, for fish, for hake, frozen hake, for example, we were talking about 8.5 million that was already exported. Then you say, do you want to really jeopardize that, even though there will be a drop in 1 million or 2 million in terms of the exportation? So you have to sit back and wait, and also because you have to weigh now in terms of the benefits and also the destruction of this tariff might also impose. So for me, my suggestion is, look, we have to wait come September, but then when you are given now that opportunity, remember there is no trade negotiations that will take place, but then you look at now what are the favorable conditions that are stipulated in that tariff. Then you can say whether they will still reduce the tariff or are they going to maintain it. If they are going to maintain it, then what is in for Namibia? Now when I say what is in for Namibia, it's where you have to start now thinking about product diversification or either market diversification. Either you have to venture into other markets, which are already opening up, while you are still looking at how things are assessing, how things are unfolding in the U.S. market.
All right. Now, perhaps let's touch more on these exported goods that are perhaps already in transit, that is to the U.S. What happens to those goods? What is going to happen now to these exported goods or products?
Yeah, unfortunately, in terms of the tariff, let's say if the tariff was effective today, for example, and your products haven't reached already, the moment it lands, then that tariff also is going to be imposed. So which means they are also affected somehow. So that is now the thinking to say, look, how long will it take also? And that's the dynamic in terms of logistic as well, and we have to think that. And also now when I talk about logistic, we have to look at now maybe the nearest markets in the African market. You look at the trade trend that we have now currently. You look at the countries like Zambia, Congo, who are already also in demand of our, because I mentioned the issue of hake, frozen hake. So then you have now to diversify to say if the issue is there, is heating up, even in terms of your timing, because the tariff imposition did not come yesterday. We heard about it. You now, as a trader, you have now to start thinking in terms of other markets that have already opened up. When I speak about other markets, we are not saying we should completely close the U.S. market. All I'm saying is diversification of markets. What they always say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Because so that you want to say, if this door closes, then you have already another agreement that you've already signed in place. Namibia have signed quite a number of trade agreements, so you have to look at those ones, and then you approach offices like now the International Relations and Trade. So, and now, as we speak, Namibia Trade Forum, they will also be able to give you in terms of what are the other opportunities, potential for the product of the Namibian producers, so that you can diversify the market. So that's why now this issue of tariff will be effectively immediately the moment that the product lands in the USA, and then you're already affected. But if you could have diversified, the moment you heard that this is already in place, you could have now maybe tried to divert in terms of now your exportation to other markets.
All right. Let's go back to the issue of employment creation. Among others, this tariffs pose that is a serious threat that is to employment creation, right? You also mentioned that a little bit. Perhaps let's just go back there and talk about how best Namibia can actually remedy this situation when it comes to the 21% new tariffs imposed that is on the country.
Yeah, the remedy in terms of employment creation is we can also look at the issue of incentives. It's better when you incentivize your producers. We are not saying we should now hold their trousers until they have grown into whatever it is might be, but we are saying give them that opportunity to grow and then put incentives in place that will now ease in terms of, because we're looking at the supply chain. In terms of production, for example, if we are talking about maybe agro-processing, we are talking about fish processing, for example, some of these products, the intermediate product, you don't find them within Namibia. You find them somewhere else. Now, this one is a typical example, the one that I've quickly have seen now on the dairy products, where they are now trying to reduce taxes to zero rated so that they can be competitive within. So if you do that, then you are looking at in terms of the production thereof and the number of employees also that are employed by this company, so that you don't now cause havoc, because we're already facing a very huge unemployment rate as we speak. So for me to say, look, the issue is that look at that, government should come in, and also in terms of infant industry protection, for example, and also to expedite the issue of what we call the export processing zone. Previously it was called the export processing zone, now it's SEZ. So those ones, you have to expedite them so that it's easier in terms of like, if it's the manufacturing incentive, for example, if you bring it on board, then it's easier incentivizing these manufacturers. You are encouraging them to produce more so that they can also now saturate either the local market, or then the surplus can also be now sent in the form of export.
All right. Robert, are you saying that Namibia is too dependent on markets like the US? And is this perhaps a wake-up call that is for the Namibian economy?
Yeah, not really, but you are looking at the preferential trade agreement that says, look, we are opening up the market for 6,400 products of Namibian products. That's specifically for Namibia. Then you say, look, these are opportunities without any tariff. Then we supposed also to make sure that we have to align ourselves to produce more, because as of current, you are only producing very less. At least it's fish, you have fish there, you have beef, you have whatever. But then, in terms of, maybe we're talking about dependence, because as of recent, the charcoal industry, they are saying, look, even though the 21% has been imposed on the Namibian products, but there are already other markets within the African markets that are imposing 36% in terms of now the exportation of our charcoal. But then for them, they are saying, look, I think it's a lucrative market still the USA, apart from the 21%. But that is not all. All we are saying is that, look, in terms of fish that I have already mentioned earlier on, we have already also others like Spain. And then we are also saying, apart from the US market, you look at the China market. Now, in terms of the China, they are saying they want to put an agreement in place with Africa so that they can start trading, even though we are already trading with China as well. If you look at most of our export, they also go to China. But then that favorable trade agreement, or either preferential trade agreement that is in place with the US, I think some companies, they have still now seen that it's better for them to trade with the USA in terms of the value that they are getting, the return of their product that they are producing. But not entirely to say maybe the US market is the only market that can be lucrative in that regard.
Let's perhaps look at new international export markets that Namibia can tend to in an effort that is to remedy this current situation.
Good. Thank you very much. In terms of the new markets, for example, is like I indicated earlier on, we have to explore. The other one that I can also talk about is the current AFCFTA. It's the African Intercontinental Free Trade Area. That is a new kid on the block, whereby we have to look at that in terms of how many markets are in there, apart from now the US market. Because remember, in terms of trade, you are looking at, they tend to, in Africa, we're supposed to also trade within Africa, and then to simplify some of these trade measures so that we can easily now access some of this market. So the best way is that look at other potential market within Africa. You spoke about the issue of the issue of in terms of now the goods that are in transit already. And then the goods are already in transit and they are in position in terms of, they are imposed in terms of tariff. Now, but if it's in terms of the market, local market that you look at, the FCFTA that I have mentioned, now it's easier in terms of diversion, in terms of now, if you have 2 to 3 countries that you're already exporting to. And also in terms of now, if you look at the market currently, apart from the USA, the diversification that I spoke about in terms of the market, you have also to look at other countries that are already now, which we are already trading with. And then it's also in terms of now the trade, whether we are in deficit or we are already in surplus in terms of the trade. So I think those are the other markets that we should look at. Spain is one of them. Then we have now the EU market that are also, we are also trying to downplay it, but then this has been also quite some times they absorbed a lot of our product from Namibia. We have looked at the issue of now the grape sector, for example. We are already, our products, our grapes are already in the EU market, and they are competitive on that level. So those are the areas that we have to look at. We are not saying completely we should close looking at the US market, but all we are saying is that we have to look at in terms of diversification, the EU market, the Germany, and all other countries that we might also talk about, so that we can start now trading with them openly, but then not closing down the door of the USA.
Right. Let's now shift our focus to neighboring South Africa. You know the percentage of those tariffs in that country. Perhaps just give us your thoughts on that. To be specific, Lesotho's 20% tariff, speaking under correction. Perhaps just give us your thoughts on that and how this will affect the economy of South Africa as well as Namibia, since we're relying on them. That is also for export and export goods as well, and seeing that we share the same currency.
Good. Yeah, I
or
think
use their currency,
yeah.
basically. Yeah.
Well, when you are looking at that space, the trading block comes into effect, which is the SACU. Well, Lesotho is part to, Namibia is part to, South Africa is the one who controls that. So it now affects also in terms of now the revenue, in terms of the revenue pool that we're always getting from the SACU trade block. So in that sense, we say, look, in terms of now the importation from the US market, that also comes outside that SACU agreement, outside that SACU trade block, then they are supposed to come in, and then we collect revenue on that. Then we put in that pool. Now, if we cut out in terms of now the importation from the USA, then it's also now affecting a little bit in terms of the revenue that we are also getting that. Now, in terms of you mentioned Lesotho. Lesotho is also a very small country in terms of its export. They're also mostly dependent in textile and other products that they're also exporting. But then how will this affect them? Because you have to look at the revenue that we are getting from the SACU pool. So that will be affected also dramatically. Now, the other issue that you look at in terms of now SACU, you look at the tariff that are set. We don't have a tariff body. The only country that sets a tariff is South Africa. Now, if South Africa is affected in terms of the tariff that are imposed on South Africa, and if you look at it in terms of the GDP, 5% of imports are coming from the USA or either export. So that is dominated by that. So now those will also cause effect on the revenue collection, and then the share thereof, where we are also dependent as Namibia, will also drop. The moment that drop, then the question that we'll be asking is where to now in terms of the other issue of developmental area, in terms of maybe our development budget, which we might also be now try to supplement as of current. So all this area, we must look at them and say, how will this affect small countries like Lesotho that you've mentioned? So these are the areas that I think is better to look at them holistically in terms of the trade block, because all of us we belong to that trade block, and it might affect us in terms of revenue collection.
All right. Now, Robert, in conclusion, what do you perhaps think the government and perhaps the private sector should do to cushion that is, or rather to cushion that is the impact of these tariffs imposed on our country?
Yeah, my observation, or rather my conclusion, is to say the first point that I mentioned in terms of we have to incentivize, come up with incentives that will incentivize our producer for them to be competitive out there. The other issue is apart from incentive, because remember we depend mostly on the raw product. Now we are saying, look, apart from the raw product that we are already exporting, let's try to emphasize the issue of value addition, whereby we have to come up with factories that we have to set up in Namibia. So that, because if these companies are incentivized, and the incentive comes with a condition to say, look, before we incentivize you, I think we should put up something. We have seen an example of Namib Mills. Sorry to use that as an example. They are already producing pastas within. What is that? That relates to, the incentive that they also got in terms of infant industry protection have made them to grow in terms of the revenue that they have received, and then to reinvest back that money into that production, that factory that they have already now. And then if you look at the pasta, it's already competitive in the local market. Our people can also afford that. So we are saying, we are not only saying we should also now try, because the other entity might come in to say, look, in terms of the issue of revenue collection, for example, our entity NAMRA, they might talk about that to say, no, look, what will happen out of the revenue collection in the country? So all we are saying is we're not cutting off all the revenue pools that might come, but we are saying let's incentivize, encourage them as well into diversifying their products. And also then we have to see, because now we are now observing the issue that the tax, the zero rate that we have now done, whether imposed in terms of now the dairy products, the yogurt, them and all that. Then we see also how are these now product consumed within. Because the other issue that we also overlook is that the local producer also, they might also start thinking of the consumers, the last person on the ground. Absolutely. After given the incentive, at least now minimize in terms of now your prices so that it's affordable for the last person on the ground. You are only looking at those ones in the employment sphere. But what about that one who only gets the grant? Maybe is an old pension or that. So that is now the effect that we'll have if we happen to incentivize. But then we have to put measures in place to say once you are incentivized, you should also look in terms of now how do you make sure that your product are also affordable within. We have fish, for example, but even the last man on the street cannot afford to consume our fish.
Sad reality.
So I'll leave it there for now.
All right. Are there any final remarks, perhaps, looking at countries that are retaliating? Do you think Namibia should go the same road, or what is your advice there?
Retaliation, like I've indicated earlier on, I think that should be used as a last resort. Because you look at how small Namibia is, how dependent are we to the South African economy, which is already affected, and also the pegging of the Namibian dollar to the South African rand. The moment you play around with these dynamics, it also costs you daily. Then you look at how will it factor in terms of the inflation rate, and also the exchange rate, and then the dollar, because the US dollar is regarded as the floating currency. So you have to look at those dynamics and look, we should sit back, we should watch first to see how the space unfold, and then we should see whether retaliation will be of necessary for now. Then you, because you have to look at or either to think about the trade war as well. So this 21% might increase to 40%.